Good morning, everyone. My name is Rich Sloma. Welcome to today's New York State Archives presentation of Introduction to Information Governance. Today's presenter is David Lowry. David is the New York State Archives Head of Local Government Advisory Services. This session is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box to the right of your screen and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. Please do not type your question into the Q&A tab since we are not using this feature. And now I will turn the presentation over to Dave.
Okay, thank you, Rich. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Just always want to make sure of that first. So, welcome everybody to the New York State Archives first ever presentation on the subject of information governance. Now, just because this is our first presentation does not really mean information governance is a new concept. As I'm sure some of you are aware, it's been around for, at least a decade now. But I am happy to say, even though this is our first formal presentation on information governance, we have talked about some of these concepts over the years. As those of you who do attend a lot of our training will see some of this here. But this is the first time we've really packaged everything up and talked about information governance as one big concept. So first, let's take a look at our agenda. Okay, so first thing to point out is, this is an introductory course, right? So it's going to be a bit more of a broad overview. We're not going to get too deep into specifics. In this one, our goal here is to just give you a good idea and feeling of what information governance is. So obviously, the first thing we want to do is define information governance. Exactly what is it? Um, then we're going to review a number of IG functions. And yes, people often call information governance just IG. And we're going to look at a bunch of these functions, 7 of them, actually. And what we're going to do is we're going to describe each one. Then we're going to look at some of the key activities in each one of those functions, just to give you an idea of how it works. And then, since I'm assuming most of us out there are records managers or work in records management somehow, we're going to take a look at the relationship of each one to records management. Okay. Then we're going to, give you a couple of examples of how IG might be applied in a real world situation. And then finally, just some tips on getting started. If you feel inspired today by this presentation that, maybe you want to start getting into IG, we're just going to give you a few tips of how you might get that whole process started. So first, let's take a look. Before we take a look at what information governance is, let's take a look at what it is not. Now, a popular misconception seems to be that IG is just another term for information technology, right? They're the same things. That is not true. Here's what is true. Information technology is a very big, important component of information governance. And we will talk about that, of course, in more detail. And here's what some assume it is, okay? And by some, I also include myself in that, because this is really is what I used to think in the early days of information governance. I kind of had this sort of, cynical opinion about it. Okay, so here was always my joke. So let's take the term information governance and say, okay, well, what's another word for information? Oh, records. Okay, what's another word for governance? Management. Oh, I see. It's just a fancy term for records management. However, I do have to admit that really wasn't accurate. It really is more than records management. I mean, thinking about information governance as, say, records management on steroids, it's not a terrible way of thinking about it, but still, it's not really accurate. Okay, so now let's take a look at some definitions. Okay, so what information governance actually is. Okay, so You can see here the first definition, it's an all-encompassing term for how an organization manages the totality of its information. And I think that's a really good, succinct definition of what information governance is. Now, if you were to say Google, define information governance, you would find, lots of definitions. Some of them are very long and confusing, don't make any sense, I think, to your average person, but I think this one does. Now, I also included the second one because I really like this because it does emphasize another part of information governance. So this one is information governance is the activities and technologies that organizations employ to maximize the value of their information while minimizing the associated risks and costs. Okay. And you're going to see we're going to talk about risk management in a while. But you can see here I emphasize maximize the value because part of information governance is also taking, all the records, information, data you have and putting it to work for your organization. Okay, we're going to talk about this, of course, a little bit more. We're going to talk about things like data analysis in a little bit. But I think these are probably your best two definitions of what information governance actually is. So let's take a look at the IG umbrella. Now you can see here, and just to make sure too that you know this isn't exactly a definitive list. This is essentially what I decided to include. But this you could look at as the IG umbrella. So these are 7 different disciplines. We can call them professions, activities, elements, whatever term you'd like to use that make up information governance. One of them, of course, you can see here is records management, a very important component of information governance. Another is data management, and in a minute we'll talk about the difference between records and data. There is a difference. Um, Information technology, okay, those are the computer people, of course. Then there's risk management, compliance, legal, and disaster management. Now you can see here there's a relation between a lot of these. So for instance, disaster management can easily be part of or folded into risk management. I decided to talk about this separately because disaster management is something that the state archives has been emphasizing for decades. So I thought that was important to talk about separately. Same thing, compliance could be part of risk management, as we'll discuss. But I thought it was important to draw these 7 out to give us a good overview of what each one of them is and how they function. So let's dive in. So records management, this is the one I'm sure most of us listening right now are most familiar with. And records management, of course, is just managing all records throughout their life cycle from the time they're created to the time they're disposed of, unless, of course, they're permanent records. And some of the key activities, of course, is to identify records. What information do you have that are records? What is not a record? Then applying the proper retention periods to those records, calculating the disposition dates, and ensuring defensible destruction. And what do I mean by defensible destruction? That means that you could defend the destruction of those records in a court of law if you had to by showing a good process that, yes, I applied the correct legal retention period to this. When it was disposed of, we kept a record of that disposition. It was authorized by the key people within the organization. Everything was done on the up and up following our proper policies and procedures. Now, of course, those of us in records management know, a records manager does more than these just four things. They also create filing systems, retrieval systems. They help decide what records will be digitized. They, index records, things like that, make them more accessible. But these are 4 of your, real key functions of records management. Now, obviously, we're not going to take a look at the relationship of records management to records management because that'd be a little silly. So now let's take a look at data versus record. So before we talk about data management, it's important to make the distinction between the two of them. So you can see here, data is what we use to create records, and a record essentially is evidence of any specific event or transactions. Now, some people do make a distinction, believe it or not, between data, information, and a record. I think that's getting way too far into the weeds for our purposes. So I really think just sticking to data versus records is fine for our purposes here. Now, I want to show you an example. I think it's the next slide of a database. Now, a long debate in records management um, has been, well, is database actually a record? And some people will say yes, because you are storing information sometimes about certain specific transactions, events, things in a database. Other people will say, well, no, because the information in a database changes so quickly, it's never really static. It can't be a record. Therefore, an information governance professional would say, well, you know what? I really don't care whether it's a record or not. It needs to be managed. Okay. That data is important, whether it's actually a record or not. Um, we need to management. And that's where the part of the idea of information governance comes in that, you know, everything, every piece of information and data you have needs to be managed, whether it actually technically falls into the records category or not. You can see this is just an example, and I'm sure you all know what a database looks like. This is from our customer relations management system, where we track information about all basically the clients of the New York State Archives, everybody we provide services to. And you can see here there are some school districts, fire districts here. So is this data just sitting in the database, that gets changed frequently? Is it actually a record? I would say probably not. But if I were to create a report out of this database saying, okay, please return all site visits that the New York State Archives made to local governments in the year 2022, then that would be a record. So you could see here what I did is I used data I had in the database to actually then create a record. So hopefully we all get now that distinction between data and a record. So let's now take a look at data management. Okay, so data management basically is just ensuring that data is true, accurate, and unique. Okay, and that's what a data manager would be in charge of, making sure what's happening. Now, I'm sure we've all heard the term, data cleansing. So if data is being cleansed, again, what you want to make sure is that data is accurate, it's up to date, it's not duplicated, okay? And there is software that has deduplication functions. So for instance, that database I just showed you there, it actually has deduplication functions. Every once in a while when I'm in it, some message will pop up and say, hey, we think that this person and this person over here are the same person. If they are, I can click OK, and it will actually combine them into the one person. Okay, so you don't have that person in there, say, 2 or 3 times. Okay, and of course, a big thing nowadays is to make sure that the data is secure. It seems there's not a day that goes by where we don't read or see in the news somewhere about some big data breach in some company. So part of the data manager's job, of course, is to make sure that data stays secure and doesn't get hacked into, and also that the data also stays secure from people who work in that company, right? Not everybody should have access to all data inside an organization. And again, that's one of the decisions a data manager would make is who gets the rights to see and use what information. So the data needs to be perfect, theoretically, okay? Because nowadays, remember when we were talking about maximizing the value of your records and information, um, a lot of organizations, including increasingly, government agencies, state agencies, local governments, will use data to make decisions, right? Projections about things. So they do things called data analysis and data mining. Now, there is a slight difference between the two of them. They are similar. So data mining, let's take a look at that first. So data mining is essentially software that goes out, can go and look in all your data, right? And it goes and it does things like it looks for patterns, right? And tries to find information, useful information for you within that data that maybe you don't even know is there. Data analysis, on the other hand, is when you have questions and you think the data can answer that question. So you go in and you analyze your data, and sometimes you maybe have to go out and get data from outside your organization to answer the question you're looking for that answer for. So again, this is why having good data is extremely important. So what's the relationship then between data management and records management? Well, the records manager needs clean data, right, to create those accurate records. So the records manager should be working with the data manager on things like data entry standards. So having uniform formats, having naming conventions, right? So inside a database, everybody's got to be on the same page of what you call one particular thing, like say a record. Okay, we're going to call this record a purchase order, a voucher, a PO, a requisition. What are you going to call it? And it doesn't matter what you decide to call it, as long as you're all using the same name. Proofing the data. Okay, how are we going to make sure that the data that's going in is accurate? You may want to periodically audit that data. Okay, to see how things are going. What is the accuracy rate on that data? And then you should work together too on things like data retention. Even though it's not a record, you're probably going to want to apply some sort of data retention period to it. So once data really becomes outdated, how are you going to remove it from that database? Do you want to extract it and back it up, or do you just want to delete it? And these are the kinds of questions the records manager would work on with a data manager. And some of you may have noticed now that a lot of like states are appointing people called like chief data officers. And this is definitely a growing and an important profession. So information technology. Now, I'm sure, we're all familiar with this. Again, information technologies, those are the computer people that we rely on. And they're going to make sure that we have the proper hardware. They're going to help us and help the data manager make sure our information is secure. They're going to help us choose the proper software that we need to do our jobs. They're going to provide internet access for us and just make sure, you know, everything is running smoothly in our information technology environment. Because think about it, nowadays, of course, if somebody took your computer away from you right now, how well could you do your job, right? We're really reliant on this information technology. And of course, almost all records today are created electronically. So it is very important for the records manager to have a good relationship with the IT folks. And here are some of the things they should work on together. Ensure all systems have records management capabilities. That is, can you get rid of that data, outdated data when you have to, or those outdated electronic records when you have to? Um, some systems do have that capability, some don't. Some you can actually buy records management applications that will apply retention periods for you and then automatically dispose of those records. You want to create preservation strategies, right, for those electronic records that you have that have long-term retentions. So you're going to want to work with IT on things like migration plans, making sure that you can migrate those records from one platform to the next, making sure that software and hardware are kept up to date, making sure that data can be extracted from certain programs easily enough and then imported into a new program. And also, records manager should promote with IT the use of an electronic content management system. And ideally, one system for an organization. Increasingly, governments are using these systems, but one problem they're running into is sometimes, three different departments will be using three different systems. And again, this is where the records manager can come in and work with IT and say, hey, is there a system that we can find that would work for everybody and just use one? Okay, so now let's talk about risk management. And this is, a really growing profession in field risk management. So, what does a risk manager do anyway? Well, he or she is going to identify, assess, and analyze risks and seek ways to mitigate them. Okay, so you can't prevent risks from actually happening, say, like a natural disaster, but you can look at ways to mitigate them to make them less likely. So one thing they do is they create what's called a risk profile. And basically a risk profile is just asking, okay, what can go wrong? So you need to look at things like, okay, internal data breaches. Okay, we have some employee, a rogue employee, getting into information he shouldn't have. Cybersecurity risks. So people from outside your organization cannot get into your data and information. What are your legal risks? Of course, natural disasters is going to be part of this, but also political risks, right? Even in the private sector, they have political risks, but hey, we're all government people, right? So political risks are much higher for us. And this is something a risk manager in government would definitely have to take into account. Then you're going to determine probabilities. Some of you may be familiar with the formula risk equals probability times cost. Okay, so here's what a risk manager would do. So let me just give you a quick example here. So let's take a look at the natural disasters. What kind of natural disasters would happen? It's like, well, say in upstate New York, would a risk manager worry about, say, an earthquake? Okay, what would be the cost of trying to mitigate the effects of an earthquake? Probably would be pretty high. So when you do that risk times probability uh, equals cost, you would say, well, the costs are way too high to mitigate this. So what we're going to do is we're just going to accept the risk because the probability of an earthquake happening, at least a major earthquake that could damage our infrastructure, is so very low. Now, when it comes to flooding, okay, that you'd probably want to spend money on and say, well, okay, flooding does happen pretty frequently in upstate New York, so we need to find ways to mitigate that risk, and it would make sense to spend money on that. And then, of course, the risk manager would implement preventative measures for that. Okay, so risk management and records management, how do they relate? Well, records and data are always at risk, as we know, but also they can be a risk, right? So records are always at risk from, say, natural disasters, from people hacking into our systems, from software viruses, things like that, vandalism. Loads of ways our records can be at risk, right? So the records manager has to work with the risk manager mitigating them. But also, the risk manager should be talking to the records manager because records themselves can be a risk, right? There's always some liability tied towards your records. So the risk manager wants to be working with the records manager, saying, hey, are you closely following the retention schedules? Okay. Getting rid of those records as soon as their retention period expires. And are you being consistent about it? Because if you're not, you're opening our organization to risk. So now you can see the relationship there between risk management and records management. Okay, compliance. And again, this is another big growing area. You know, And it's really growing too in government. So, for instance, 20% of federal agencies now have a compliance officer. Just over 10% of state agencies, and this is all states, not just New York, have compliance officers, and just under 10% of local governments across the country have compliance officers. And like I said, it's really a growing field. And this is probably going to start becoming more and more common as time goes on. So here's something I'm curious about. Okay, so if your organization, okay, has a compliance officer or you have some sort of compliance function, if you could just pop that into the chat box and then at the end, Rich can take a look at it and let us know if anybody is doing this function within their local government. If you're not, no reason to say no, but if you are, I think it would be good to know, see how many people out there might actually be doing compliance right now. So what is compliance anyway? So compliance is just ensuring that an organization is following all laws, regulations, and internal policies. So what would a compliance officer do? Well, she might identify the laws and regulations that need to be complied with, right? Establish policies and procedures, and then train staff. Ensure that all data and reporting guidelines are met. Okay. Conduct compliance audits. Okay. Are people really complying with things? And correct identified compliance violations, because compliance does affect us in records management. There are laws we need to comply with, right? An obvious one is FOIA, right? The Freedom of Information Law. For you, say town and village clerks out there who are the registrars of vital records, that's birth, death, and marriage records, you know that the Department of Health, right? They've got lots of regulations over the creation and maintenance of those vital records, and you have to follow that. And again, this is where a compliance officer can be helpful. Okay, so we've talked about compliance and risk management. And the reason why I wanted to just talk about this for a moment is there are some folks who will just say, well, compliance and risk management, they're really the same thing. There's no reason to really make a distinction. Um, but I think, there actually is some distinction here. So I want to take a quick look at this. So you can see here compliance tends to have a very narrow focus. It's just complying with actual laws, regulations, and policies, right? Risk management, now you can look at compliance as part of risk management, obviously, but that has a much broader focus, right, than just compliance. It's, as we just talked about, it looks at lots of different risks and lots of different things. Compliance is basically focused on the here and now, right, on the current. A compliance officer is just going to look at complying with current laws and regulations where um, he's not, well, put it this way, the compliance officer is not going to sit around and think about, okay, what laws and regulations might come into effect in the future, right? He's not going to worry about that. Well, the risk manager, he's mostly focused on the future. Okay, what are the risks that might happen down the road, and how do we mitigate them? So you can see here, there definitely is a difference, but you could within an organization fold compliance under the risk management if you needed to. So compliance and records management, how do they relate? Well, obviously you need records to prove compliance, right? So say in an audit, you're going to have to produce records to prove you're complying with various fiscal laws and regulations. And as I just discussed, the records manager must comply with records laws. And this is how the compliance officer and the records manager can work together on this subject. Okay, legal. Now, oftentimes we'll have to get lawyers involved in many issues with records management and with information governance. So, okay, so what does legal do? Legal is going to provide that legal guidance in the development and implementation of IG policies. So here are some of the things they're going to do. They're going to review and approve retention schedules. So for instance, many of you know that we produce retention schedules for local governments and for state agencies. Now, when we update those retention schedules, they go through a review process, and the very last people to review them are the lawyers in the New York State Attorney General's office. Okay, so until they put their stamp of approval on it, we cannot issue those schedules. And it is important for your lawyer to look at things like that. They're going to assist the compliance officer in identifying laws and regulations. They can provide guidance on FOIL. Now, if you've got a basic FOIL request, there's probably not going to be an issue there. You're just going to say, well, okay, I'll just, produce the records as requested. But if it falls into a gray area, here's where you might want to talk to your lawyers as well as the folks at the Committee on Open Government, and then identify records needed during legal discovery and issue a records hold. This is a big thing lawyers will do in records management and information governance. If your organization is involved in a lawsuit, you have to make sure that you're not disposing of records that could be relevant to that suit. So it's the lawyer's job to take a look at what records you have, which ones might be relevant, and then to issue what's called a records hold. That means disposition on those records must stop. Now, some lawyers get um, very cautious and they'll just put a blanket disposition and just say, hey, until this lawsuit's done and over with, we're not going to dispose of any records. So legal and records management, this one's, pretty basic and straightforward. We know that the law impacts records in many ways, as we've just discussed, but also in another way, your lawyer can help is over the years, a lot of case law um, around records management has been created. So, for instance, there have been cases where judges have ruled that all organizations should have a records management program, something as simple as that. Um, they know how long you have to produce records and discovery, things like that. So the lawyers can be very helpful to the records manager, and of course the records management to the legal folks. Disaster management. Now, here's a subject I'm sure some of you are pretty familiar with, because the state archives, as I said, for a long time, we've really promoted the concept of disaster management. But obviously, we're looking at disaster management essentially just for records. Now, a disaster manager in an organization would be looking to protect all assets, not just records, right? So the disaster manager plans for the prevention of and the recovery from a disaster. Okay, because you're going to try really hard not to be affected by a disaster, but sometimes, despite your best efforts, you still will be. And so the disaster manager will be the one to help you recover from that disaster. Okay, so what does the disaster manager do? Well, take action to prevent or mitigate a disaster. Create and test a recovery plan, right? So you should have a disaster management plan. And it really is good to test them and see how it works, kind of in a real life simulation, see how things go. And again, in a case like this, the disaster manager will be looking to protect all assets, not just records. And also, this person would prepare a business continuity plan, which means, okay, town hall burnt down today. How do we open up for business tomorrow? And it would be the disaster manager's job to make sure there's some sort of plan on how that would happen. Okay, so disaster management and records management. Obviously, records are a vital asset in any organization, and this should be one of the top things a disaster manager is looking to protect. Um, because usually, and we at the State Archives have been saying this for years, when you look at the most important assets within an organization, the first one is always the employees, right? The people. But we've always argued that records are probably number two, right? Because really, it's very difficult for those people to do their job. without the records, okay? Okay, so let's take a look at a quick example. Actually, we have two examples here of how IG might be applied in real life situations. So let's take a look at applying IG to social media. Most local governments and state agencies now have some sort of social media presence, I'm sure, right? You're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, maybe things like that. So who's going to have to be involved within your social media policies? Well, IT, that's an obvious one because it is a technology platform. After all, uh, risk managers, very important to be involved with social media because social media posts can prove risky um, and backfire. And nowadays, in many organizations, um, it can take a long time from the time somebody comes up with a concept for a social media post to the time it is actually posted. Um, this probably happens more in the private sector world because if you make a bad social media post, that's oftentimes a black eye for your organization. Um, Compliance. You want to ensure that internal procedures and social media company rules are followed. Think about how embarrassing it would be if your organization got, you know, um, banned from Twitter because it wasn't properly following the rules of Twitter. Records management. Important role is to identify the records that are created on social media, then apply retentions and ensure their long-term preservation and data management. So what do you do with those non-records that are on social media? That would fall within the realm of probably the data manager's job to help figure that one out. Okay, so let's take a look at one more example. Electronic messaging, right? This is a big one. So who needs to be involved here? You can see it's going to be a lot of the same people. But what's their role going to be with this? So, okay, so who needs to be involved? Well, IT, obviously, and probably more involved than within social media, because oftentimes your email systems are internal. And it's your IT people who are actually managing those systems, where with social media, um, that's an outside technology that your IT folks don't even have any control over, other than just basically getting you access to the actual software. Risk management. Now you can see I put email is toxic in quotes, okay, because that's my way of saying I did not come up with that quote. That was a lawyer who said that one time about email. And email is toxic to an organization because unfortunately, employees still tend to do and say a lot of stupid things um, on email. Okay. And so one thing the risk manager wants to do is like, okay, so how can we start mitigating some of these risks? Okay, people doing dumb things with email. So setting, very strict policies about what you can discuss on email, what you can't discuss on email, things like that. Disaster management. Okay, so if your email is being stored on servers internally, the disaster manager should be aware of that and saying, okay, how are we going to make sure that this information is protected, it's backed up? Um, and so he's going to have to be involved in that. Compliance, you're going to want to ensure that internal procedures on email, texting, and even things like the use of mobile devices, because people often use their mobile devices for email and personal computers, because a lot of people work from home nowadays, and they're using their personal computers oftentimes to access their email. Records management. Okay. Again, they're going to identify the records, apply the retentions, and ensure the long-term preservation of those emails that fall into the records category. What about those that don't fall into the records category? Well, again, that should probably fall into the realm of the data manager. Okay, so let's just say that today you're really inspired by this presentation and say, well, I want to really start thinking more about information governance. Can we get some kind of a information governance program going at my organization? It would be, some of your first steps. You'd want to just start a conversation with people and just say, hey, are you familiar with this information governance stuff? I went to a presentation the other day on it. I think it's something we should start doing. And then if you get enough people involved, you might want to, well, one thing you might want to do first is then go to your chief administrative officer, or if you don't have access to that person, maybe somebody who does, get their ear, start getting some management support for it, and then forming a committee, and then probably at that point doing more research, right? Like I said, today we're just trying to give you a good overview of what information governance is and some of its chief activities. But you probably would need to do more research on building an information governance program. And then to start implementing, you might want to do something like conduct an audit or study of each area. And by area, it could be an area of information governance, one of those disciplines like, say, compliance. Okay, so how do we start a compliance program? Or it could just take a look at each one of your departments within your organization individually and seeing how things are going there. Um, then defining the roles and responsibilities. Okay, who's going to do what? So we need somebody to take a look at the compliance component, to be a compliance officer. Who would be the best person for that? And how in the organization would we fit that? Okay, so if we were going to do risk management, should we just combine risk management and compliance in one person or one function? And those are the kind of decisions you'd have to make. And then finally, develop policies and procedures. And this really is a big part of information governance. It really is something I think that's driven a lot by just having these overarching policies for your organization, making sure that all information data records are being properly governed and managed. Okay, so having said all of that for about, let's see, 42 minutes, Rich, it does look like I saw questions popping up.
Yes, Dave, got a couple of questions here. First, I just want to, someone asked if this will be, if there's a recording available, and yes, we are recording as we speak, and the recording will be made accessible to folks through our website by clicking on workshops and then webinars, or you can also go to the New York State Archives YouTube page, and I did put the links in there, but we're easy enough to find on Google as well. Okay, have a question here from Griselda. Should we work in information governance into a records retention and disposition policy, or should that be a separate policy?
I think the retention and disposition would be part of a broader, information governance policy. Um, I think that'd be the best way to put it. Yeah, but working retention and disposition, because even if it doesn't, as we talked about, fall into the records category, in a lot of ways, a lot of this does fall into retention and disposition still. Okay, how do you get rid of that outdated data, for instance? So, like I said, thinking about information governance as records management on steroids is not a terrible way to look at it.
Okay, Roger asks, please give some examples of what could be considered records in social media. I don't get it.
Oh, okay. Um, just to let you know, we do have a very nice publication you might want to take a look at by our own Sarah Derling here at the New York State Archives. So one that could be a press release. Okay, so if you release some sort of important information on social media, and only on social media, which more and more organizations are doing today. That's their press release. That's how you could see that falls into a records category. Um, if, say, on social media, a local resident makes some sort of complaint or request, that's, if you look at the LGS one, that's a record. Now, looking at social media posts, I think you're right that, some of this stuff's going to fall into a gray area. And again, this is where the information governance professional might say, well, I don't really care whether it's a record or it's not a record, it needs to be managed. But you can define some records on social media, though. But that was a very good question.
Okay, Lee asks for fire districts, how long is the retention for the external audits conducted annually?
Ooh, don't know that one off the top of my head. Um,
We could certainly
but
point Lee to our records advisory officer for
yeah,
as well.
Maria McCashin would be able to help you specifically with that question.
All right, well, I'll see if I can't get Lee and Maria speaking, unless, of course, they're already talking, but I can
Okay,
certainly arrange for that.
that'd
Okay, I
be
have a
great.
question here from Lisa. Can you share an example of an information governance policy with attendees?
Um, yeah, we don't actually have one right now, or one that I'm aware of. You could Google, sample information governance policies and might come up with something, but that's a good question, and I think that's something that the state archives, especially now that we've done some training on this, may want to look into in getting, of course, we do have, sample records management policies and procedures, but nothing for IG as of yet.
Okay, I don't see any other questions at this point in time, so maybe we can give folks here a chance
Okay,
to
great.
type something in if they have anything on their mind. And I figured as long as we're waiting, I just want to let everyone know that if you happen to be watching this session in a larger group, say two, three, or four or more of you, if you could type that number into the chat box, that would be helpful. But if there's just one
Oh,
person, no need to do that.
oh, Rich, I just I had a question myself because I think I saw during the presentation somebody did say they did have a compliance officer. Did many people
That
respond
was,
to
yeah.
that?
Kimberly said Union Endicott Central School District has a compliance officer.
Ah, that's great. Was that the only one, or?
And then also Griselda said my primary role is Director of Policy and Compliance, as well as being the Records Management Officer.
Oh, great. Great. Okay. Yeah. So this is again, a concept that's really growing and becoming more and more important. So I'm glad to hear that.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. Yeah, we still have about 12 minutes to go, but
Okay.
suppose if folks are all tapped out, certainly your call, Dave.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like, people have asked that question. So, and of course, folks, if as questions come up, contact us or your records advisory office, or you can contact me. We have other staff here in the state archives to help you. And I hope you found this useful today. I hope this gave you a good, feel for what information governance is. And like I said, keep in touch.
Thanks, everybody.